All right, there
Hey,
we go.
there he is.
All right, very good. Good. Let me see if I can.
I noticed you're recording already, Joe.
What's that again?
I saw that you're recording already. Did you want
I
to?
didn't mean to.
All right.
We'll pause that. Recording now.
All right.
And we are now recording, just so everybody's aware of that. So if anybody has any dispensation against being the recording or being involved in this, now is the time to exit. But we are going to record this, and so fair warning. And we have about we're gonna give it about 3 or 4 minutes for everybody to kind of settle in, make sure everybody's good to go, make sure James is still on board with this.
Yeah, good to go.
And Jason, everything's going good for you?
Everything looks good on this end.
Great.
Just to any of our attendees, please feel free to put in the chat how you heard about this program and where you're watching from. We're curious about how far this author talk has made it.
Yeah, absolutely. That is kind of the great thing about this Zoom platform is I'm here in St. Louis, Missouri at the library right now in an office. Jason, I believe, is doing his bit from his home in South St. Louis. James, you're in Maine, correct? So I would not be surprised we have people from all over the country tuning in, especially with the association of the USS Plunkett being the focus.
Right. Yeah.
So it just turned 1 o'clock. We're going to give it just a minute, just one more minute to make sure everybody might be getting in. Hopefully, there's a whole large audience listening to us right now, but it's the internet, so everything lives forever, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Which may be a blessing and a mixed blessing.
It is definitely two sides of the same sword.
Yeah.
So we welcome everyone who has registered and gotten their link. It is a pleasure to have a program to host again. My name is Joe Schwartz, and I am a programming coordinator for the St. Louis Public Library. And since, what was it, March of last year, there are no in-person programs at the library. So I've been pulling a double duty as a public safety officer at the Central Library and various branches. And I am glad to be able to serve the public still in a capacity. And now that we're stepping back into programs, let me welcome you to the St. Louis Public Library. Although we are now doing programs via Zoom and other outlets on social media, we are still as dedicated as ever to providing the best experience possible to those who visit our 109-year-old institution, no matter how it's done. If you'd like to visit our website, that is www.slpl.org. And for those of you who are in the neighborhood near one of our 17 locations, our real brick and mortar locations are open. Generally, our hours are condensed due to COVID-19, but customers can come to their favorite library branch and browse the shelves for up to half an hour and use a computer for 1 hour. If you have become a fan of our curbside pickup, don't forget to ask about our mobile print app when picking up your items. It's very helpful. I'm proud to say we are recording this event so that others can enjoy this program at any time later on the library's YouTube channel. I encourage you to subscribe today so that you'll be able to visit this and other wonderful library programs, as well as share them with your friends. Now, James Sullivan is the author of Unsinkable, 5 Men and the Indomitable Run of the USS Plunkett. Of course, if you've not read or heard this story before, 5 incredibly brave men, you are in for a real treat. If you're already familiar with the tale, I'm sure you'll enjoy this presentation featuring both the caretaker of this story, James Sullivan, and a firsthand account of a sailor who was actually there, Jim Phelps. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, James Sullivan.
Thank you, Joe. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about this story with St. Louis. There are 5 men at the heart of this story, Unsinkable, and one of them is Jim Phelps, who grew up in Overland, Massachusetts, in Overland, Missouri, just outside St. Louis. And one of the other of the 5 men was my grandfather's brother, John Gallagher. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I found my way to this story, just sort of generally over a couple of 3 slides. And then I'm going to really focus on Jim Phelps's narrative thread through the Second World War. Joe mentioned that I'm the author of this book, and I guess that's true, but this book wouldn't exist if it were not for Jim Phelps. I'll talk a little bit about how we got together. But when I think of Jim, I often think of a man who's more of a collaborator on this story. He shared a lot with me, and a lot of what he did informs this book. He's the reason why it'll endure on some shelves for a while anyway. So one other note, you look at the cover of this book, it looks an awful lot like military history, and there's plenty of that in there because this ship went through a lot. It was the only Navy ship to participate in all 6 invasions in North Africa and in the European theater during the Second World War. And essentially, this book is let's see. Essentially, this book is a story of a search for someone, and so that's what. And so, as much as it looks like military history, it's the story of a search. And in truth, I think all military history can be read as family history, because all the characters in a military history, they had a mother and a father and a brother and a sister, and so often when we tell these big stories about the war, we forget that, and I tried to remember that as I told this story. So as we get underway here, I'd like to play just a short video that sort of introduces the arc of the Plunkett story during the Second World War. So this video is just about 3 minutes. After that, I've got about 18 slides that we'll try to work through. A couple, well, I'll just get going on the video and then we'll take it from there.
On January 21st, 1944, at 1300 hours, deckhands on the USS Plunkett hauled anchor as the crew made preparations to get underway. On the bridge, Captain Ed Burke checked orders that called for his destroyer to proceed to the vanguard of a convoy that included 38 landing craft. In the forward fire room, water tender Jim Phelps lit the number 2 and number 4 boilers, readying the ship's power plant. On the highest part of the ship, gunnery officer Ken Brown squeezed through a hatch in the fire control director to join 5 other men who would manage the ship's battery of 5-inch guns. And in the number 3 gun tub, John Gallagher leaned over the apron of the 20-millimeter gun he manned at general quarters and looked back into the convoy, wondering which of those landing craft carried his brother Frank, a medic in the 5th Army who'd be going ashore in the first wave. The sailors on Plunkett were old hands at getting underway. They'd come into the war at Casablanca more than a year earlier and had been steaming toward the red-hot center of it ever since. They'd come under aerial assault for the first time at Gela in Sicily. After 36 straight hours at general quarters, they wrote in their diaries that it was a day they'd never forget. Soon enough, that day would become a day just like any other, and then they would get worse. The Maddox went down with 211 of her crew in that first invasion off Gela. They'd seen the Rowan hit in the Gulf of Salerno and watched her go down with 200.
Oh, I'm sorry.
On January
Oh, looks like I've I've started us back at the beginning. And
21st,
I'm not sure I know how to
1944.
fast forward.
At 1300 hours, deckhands on the USS Plunkett hauled anchor.
I'm going to stop that. Hey, Joe, I wonder, do we have, we've got Jim Feltz, and I want to make sure that we've got him on the call. Do you know if we've got everybody admitted? Ah,
I'm seeing just the three of us. I sent a link to Jim's email, and they just have to click on that to join our group.
yeah, have we got, I know sometimes we can see other people on the scroll here. I see you and me and Jason. But I wonder if we've got everybody. Hey, Jason, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Can you tell whether we've got everybody admitted here?
I'm only seeing us three as panelists. I don't see Jim in yet as a panelist.
Ah, okay. Do you see others that can see the presentation?
There's 12 attendees that are watching. I see someone joining now as a panelist.
There she is.
Okay.
Yeah, Jennifer. Mhm.
Okay.
It's going to take.
Oh.
We lost her.
They lost her. Must be having connection problems.
All right. Let's see. Try that again. I apologize for the. Let's see. We'll try, well, I thought I'd try one more thing. Make sure we've got Jim. Yeah, I know Jennifer Cruz, that'll be where Jim is.
Mhm.
So let me see if we can't get that connected. At any rate, I guess we'll just proceed with the presentation, and we'll see if once we see Jennifer Cruz back, we'll have Jim. So at any rate, I'll jump ahead here to there was the video that gave the overview of the story. And I'll talk a little bit now about where this story began. For me, at any rate, my great uncle Frank Gallagher. He told this one story that was the most famous story in my family across all the branches of my family, and it was about the time that he met his brother John Gallagher in Naples in January of 1944, in the midst of the war. John and Frank were two of five Gallagher brothers, and four of them had gone away to the war. And Frank was a medic in the Fifth Army, and John was a fireman on the USS Plunkett. And they had one reunion in Africa right before the invasion at Salerno, and that was in September of 1943. John had been in the thick of it for a couple of 3 months by then, and Frank was just wading in. Salerno was to be his first invasion of the war. But as we got to, well, the invasion at Anzio happened because the Allies in Europe, in Italy, could not get past Monte Cassino and the Gustav line. The Germans had essentially fortified this line across the Italian boot south of Rome. The Allies had come into the war at Sicily, and after 30 days, they were able to take Sicily. And then they turned their attention to the European mainland. And before the invasion at Normandy in June of 1944, the Allies invaded Italy in September of 1943. And as I say, they began to march up the boot toward Rome. The objective was Rome, but they could not get past the big guns on Monte Cassino. So this is when Winston Churchill stepped in. The Prime Minister of Great Britain was ever the man for micro military management. And he decided that he would inspire the military to do an end run around Monte Cassino, to land, to take 36,000 infantrymen and land them at Anzio, and thereby get around Monte Cassino, and then they could proceed up the road to Rome, which was about 25 miles north of Anzio. So right on the verge of that, right on the verge of the invasion of Anzio, the Fifth Army has come into Naples now, and they're in various staging areas. And Frank Gallagher finds out that, or believes that the Plunkett, his brother's ship, is going to be part of the invasion. And the invasion at Salerno was so hot, he thought, well, you know, I have got to have one more reunion before we go into Anzio. So he steals out of camp one day. He's got this 5-gallon jerry can that he has filled with red wine on the way into the port of Naples, and he's looking for his brother, and he goes down to this mole here on the Mediterranean seaboard. They call these piers moles, and he finds the flagship of the task force, the Biscayne, and he asks one of the sailors on board if the Plunkett is part of this task force, and this man on the Biscayne, he can't verify anything, but he says, yeah, look, the Plunkett's in the area. So Frank is, you know, he's got his wine. I'm sure he's hauling off it a little bit now and then, a little bit glorious with the wine. He decides that he's going to try to get out among these Navy vessels that are moored in the harbor. So he crosses, there's a little castle here, and the famous Italian neighborhood of Santa Lucia is over here off screen. And that, from Santa Lucia, you could have easier access to the ships that are out in the harbor. So Frank wanders over there with his wine, and he gets to the edge of this this little pier, and he sees a bunch of Italian men in these little wooden boats called bumboats. And so this is the story that Frank told, you know, his whole life. He died at the age of 98 in 2012. But he told it so many times that each of us, if we were to sit down before the cameras of Ken Burns, you know, we'd have been able to tell the story ourselves. I'll let Frank tell the rest of the story here himself on a recording I made of him in 1998.
A little Italian was there at the pier. I jumped in, I said, roll up the harbor. And he yelled, no, I said, roll up the goddamn harbor. And I get out there, and don't you think I saw the Plunkett? Yeah. And I climbed full of ships. Climbed over the back of it. Yeah. I should have been shot dead. I had a can. It could have been a mine or anything. Yeah. You're supposed to, I didn't know anything about the Navy. You're supposed to go to the gangplank, walk up, salute the flag, and ask permission to board. Yeah. So then the captain called General Quarters, they call it. These Navy terms I never do. Now, there's about 250 sailors on a destroyer. They were all up in the bridge and down and everything. I'm standing in a little car piece of my 5-gallon can of wine, and he's blasting the shit out of the John like that. That looks like my truck. Oh, jeez, they come down, the captain was all right. His name was Burke. He said, get on and bunk with your brother there. We find out what we're going to do with you and everything else. So I had beer and everything else. The captain had kept the wine. I didn't shit with you. That's bigger than your house of wine. Yeah. So they got a red alert, they call it. They're alerted. Now they're going for the invasion. Oh, yeah. And they put me ashore about 11 o'clock at night.
So that was that story that Frank told his whole life. And so, as I said, they had this one prior reunion, and Frank told this story, and it had a beginning and a middle, and we knew what the ultimate outcome of the story was, but we really didn't know what happened, not in any detail and not in a meaningful way. You know, we had the legend of the story, but we didn't have any of the facts. So in the spring of 2016, I'm on the verge of a family trip to Italy. We were going to go to Rome and Venice and Florence. And I had an idea for a day trip to Pompeii, but it was too far from Rome for a day trip. But Anzio was very close. And as soon as it occurred to me that we could get to Anzio, where these two men had this reunion, I thought, well, we've got to do that. And moreover, I began to wonder if any of the men who were on the ship at Anzio were still alive. And so what I ended up doing is I went up to the internet, and I began to search for men who'd been on the Plunket, and I found a page for the Plunket's last reunion in 2011. I met a man named Ted Mueller, and I called Ted. He came onto the Plunket after Anzio, but he said there was a man that lived outside St. Louis named Jim Feltz, and he said he's a real nice fella, and I'm sure he'd talk to you. So Ted had Jim's two phone numbers, a home phone and a cell phone, and so I called Jim on his cell phone on a Saturday morning, and he was at a home show, which I thought was just great. He was in his 90s by then. He was 91 years old, and when you think of going to a home show, it's oftentimes a young couple who's shopping for backsplash for a new kitchen counter maybe, or new appliances. But Jim is there, and I'm thinking, well, this is great. He's in his 90s and he's at a home show. He's going to do some renovation on his house. Well, anyway, I caught him on his cell phone. I told him I was interested in the USS Plunket, and we began to talk. And we talked for about 5 minutes or so, and I could hear there were people behind him, and he said, "Look," he said, "I'd love to talk to you some more about this. Would you give me a call back when I'm at home tomorrow?" And I said, I certainly will. And then I said, I thought to give him the name of my great uncle at that point. And I told him, I said, well, my grandfather's brother, one of my grandfather's brothers was named John J. Gallagher. And there's silence in the wake of that name. And I know that Jim is, there are 250, 275 men on a destroyer, and it's been 70 years. And I know he's trying to remember a name, I think, perhaps to not disappoint me. And then I think the call has dropped, and I look at the face of my phone, but it's still there. And then Jim comes back to me, and in his voice, there is a smile as big as the moon. And he says, Johnny Gallagher was a very good buddy of mine. And I'm gonna stop the share here and see if we can't get Jim to join us here. I think I can see that he is here, or he was here. I think he's, have we got to unmute him, Joe or Jason? Or I think if we, Pat, if you.
I am asking them to unmute now. They just
if you
start their
unmute
mic.
the video.
There they go. I see they've unmuted.
Okay.
Can you hear us, guys?
We can hear you.
Wonderful. There you go, James.
All right, very good. We've got you on voice. Have we got you on camera too?
I guess so. I don't know.
Okay.
Hey!
We've got you.
You look great, Jim.
All right. Jim, you were as surprised as I was by that phone call, weren't you?
Well, yeah, I really was. For 65 years, John was on my mind all the time. It seemed like it. And you know why. And when you said that name, it really startled me. It just took everything out of me, it seemed, for a minute. And that's why the hesitation was about. And because I'd been not worrying, but he was on my mind all the time. And, you know, since I found out the true story of everything, I think of him a lot, but it don't bother me anymore. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, good. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit, Jim, as we go along here. It's sort of interesting. I was able to provide a little bit of closure for Jim on a question that he had and had been thinking about for almost 70 years. But before we talk about that, I think I'll jump back into Jim's story. I want to tell a little bit about Jim and Jim as a young man. This is Jim here, right when he came out of the boot, the Great Lakes boot training. And let's see, Jim. Why don't we start? We'll start a little bit about your background. You were born in Overland. You grew up in Overland, and in high school, you transitioned into a job at a Five and Dime at Siegel's Five and Dime in Overland. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about where you were, Jim, on where you were and what you were doing when you heard the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor.
Well, the floor walker was named Ed Canuzzi, and he would rent himself out on the weekends to decorate store windows. That was his thing.
That's what you were doing on that Sunday. You were working on decorating.
He would get $1.75, I think it was, and I'd get 75 cents. And we would decorate store windows. And we was in a ladies' store decorating the window, and some guy come down the street and blowing his horn. Naturally, we all looked up, and the guy yelling, "Pearl Harbor's been bombed," you know. So that's how we got word that it all happened. And at that time, Pearl Harbor didn't ring a bell to me at all, because I was just 16, and it didn't, things like that didn't worry me then, you know.
Sure.
But
right.
That's how I got word that the Pearl Harbor had been there. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, Jim had started. There were a few things that were keeping Jim in Overland at that time. This is the where Jim's story in this book begins, here at the Overland Dollar Store, and you know, in Overland in 1941 was a fair-sized town, about 3,000 people, and was named for you know, the emigrant trail that routed northwest out of St. Louis, bound for up Missouri River crossing. And so Jim was living here at that time, working in this shop, and this is where he was. I think, Jim, you said you were working in you and the floor walker were working in a ladies' dress shop when you found out about Pearl Harbor. But this is where Jim worked in this Five and Dime. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there were a few things keeping Jim in Overland at that time, not the least of which was a young woman that he met. Her name was Betty Niemiller, and she was the niece of a woman named Mickey Betts, who worked at the Five and Dime in Overland. And Mickey really liked Jim sort of as a younger brother, and wanted to introduce him to her niece, and she did that. And so, you know, this is before Pearl Harbor. And so Jim is starting to date Betty Niemiller. But the deck seemed stacked against him for a bunch of different reasons. And this is part of Jim's story in this book. You see, Betty loved to dance, loved to jitterbug, and Jim didn't dance at all. She was going to secretarial school and had all kinds of ambitions. And in the beginning, she was only going out with him as a favor to her aunt. But by and by, they developed, you know, they were 16 and 17 years old at that time. And so in April of 1942, Jim got swept up into the war, and it was really like that, wasn't it, Jim? It wasn't, everybody was going and you just decided to go.
Well, no, everybody was going, and I said, well, I'm going to get in this too. So I went to the Navy and I talked to a couple fellas, and he said, join the Navy. That's the way to go. You always got a dry bed and hot meals. And so that's where I went.
That's right. So Jim did his basic up at the Great Lakes. In August of 1942, he was in New York City. And he was waiting for his assignment. In the beginning, Jim wanted to go on the submarines, but they had billeted him on this pier in Brooklyn, and it was actually a building, but they called it a ship, and it was, you know, sort of miserable conditions, and they were desperate to get off it. And so one day there was a call for volunteers, and Jim and another fella named Petrie, I think, they decided that they would volunteer for assignment on a ship called the Plunkett. And I'll tell you just a little bit about the Plunkett. You know, when you think of Navy ships during the Second World War, there were 5 principal kinds of ships. There were the aircraft carriers. They weren't really a big deal in the European theater. They were in the Pacific. There were battleships. They weren't really a big deal in the Pacific or the Mediterranean or the European theater. The battleship's day had really come and gone by then. There were submarines, of course. That was the 3rd kind of ship. There were cruisers, both light and heavy cruisers, which had about 1,000 men. And the 5th class of ship was the destroyer. And the destroyer did a bunch of different things. It was designed in the late 19th century to destroy torpedo boats. And that it was originally called a torpedo boat destroyer. Pretty soon they just dropped torpedo boat and they called them destroyers. During the First World War, we saw the era of strategic bombing come into being, literally with pilots in open cockpits throwing bombs out the cockpits onto, you know, the troops or ships below. And so the destroyers acquired anti-aircraft weapons during the First World War so they could fight threats coming at them from the air. So you had, you know, they were screening ships. They would engage in surface combat. There wasn't a lot of that, but and they were also battling against ships that were coming from below the surface of the water, from submarines. That's what the depth charges were doing. They would throw their depth charges from K guns or Y guns, or roll them off the fantail when they made contact with the submarine. So destroyers did a little bit of everything. It was the first ship in harm's way, and it screened convoys, and that's where Jim began. This is what the ship looked like within a day or two of Jim Felt's coming aboard the Plunkett. It was painted in camouflage. This picture was taken August 5th, 1942. And Jim, you remember that, don't you? You remember that you came aboard the Plunkett and the next day you left.
Oh, yes. I came aboard, me and one other fellow named Petrie. We came aboard together, and if you ever been in a shipyard when they were working on these things, there's steam hoses, water hoses, sewer hoses, and everything sticking up over the lifelines and that. And I thought to myself, what did I get into, you know? And but anyway, it worked out okay, and I slept in the mess hall. Had to put my hammock up and have it up and tight by 7 in the morning, and I couldn't get in it for 7 at night. But I made okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Jim, you once told me that there were 2 songs when the ship left, when Plunkett left New York, there were 2 songs that you heard playing in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Do you remember what those 2 songs were?
String of Pearls and Kalamazoo. Yeah, Kalamazoo and String of Pearls.
Yeah, and
Yeah, they always played when you left the shipyard. They always played the songs of some sort, you know.
right.
Every time one of them got on the way. Yeah.
So this is how Jim and I began to talk. Jim began to tell stories like this to me, and I'll tell you a little. I'll read just a little bit, a couple of paragraphs from the book here to see. You know, you've just heard Jim talk about that, and he and I talked about this for I don't know how many hours. I'd ask him the same question over and over, and Jim always had something new to remember. And this is how I read about Jim's coming aboard the Plunkett. And this is just a little bit from the book. I wrote, over those first few months as an apprentice seaman, he'd been sleeping in a hammock tied up in the mess, rising in the morning before the first round of breakfast and retiring only after everyone had had supper and perhaps a movie. The bunk you were supposed to get on a Navy ship, the putative bunk, was elusive. The crummy sleeping situation notwithstanding, the worst part about being an apprentice seaman was the duty. Jim was constantly painting while at sea, and when the ship came in, he was constantly chipping paint. He'd made it known he wanted into the electricians department when there was an opening. And when a job opened in the forward fire room and the engineering officer asked if he wanted on that crew known generally as the Black Gang, at least until a spot opened in the electricians department, Jim didn't think twice. He lugged his sea bag down from a locker in the mess to the engineering department in the rear of the ship. His new berth wasn't all that way to the stern. There were deckhands in that compartment, men they sometimes referred to as deck apes when they felt like denigrating them. He climbed down the ladder to the first platform and stepped through a bulkhead door into the torpedo men's tiny compartment, and then into a larger compartment with 3 aisles and 4 lengths of bunks stacked 3 high. His new home was dimly lit, and a record scratched out a plaintive melody playing off a Victrola shelved on the port side of the compartment, sometimes in fine fiddle, but sometimes with a voice that slowed strangely to a drawl. He vaguely recognized all of his new bunkmates. One of the men in his compartment had eyebrows that were wide and full, not Groucho Marx by any means, but headed in that direction. His smile yanked up slightly to the right, tentatively, and in this, there was an implicit recognition that things didn't always turn out for the best. This was Dutch Gebhardt. Another man had front teeth slightly more protuberant than anyone would have liked. He had a widow's peak so exact it looked drawn, and a certain puffiness under the eyes that lent him the appearance of someone who should have been wearing glasses, except that his eyes were excellent. This was John Gallagher. And Jim's bunk, it turns out that Jim took a bunk that was right underneath my great uncle John. And for a year and a half, these guys were shipmates in the same compartment and sleeping right above and below each other. So that's how John and Jim came together. So you can imagine my surprise, and perhaps Jim's too, when we reconnected in 2016. I'll tell you a little bit more about these guys now. In the fall of now we're getting into the war. It's the fall of 1942, and the Plunkett steams into the war at Casablanca. And in fact, they were at Casablanca on the very day in late November when the famous Humphrey Bogart movie Casablanca made its debut in New York. And so while the Free French were marching into the Hollywood Theater and singing the Marseillaise prior to the first screening of that movie, Jim and several of his friends from the Plunkett were on liberty in Casablanca, and they wandered into this photographer's studio and had some pictures taken. Now, I'll tell you, this is Jim Feltz right here behind this little French kid. This is Irving Gebhardt over here, and this is John Gallagher over here. And it's like these 5 guys all became friends because they were all the same height. And so they're in this photographer's studio, and one picture is not good enough. So here they are again. Here's John Gallagher down here. There's Jim there. And there are these 2 Army guys and a French foreign sailor. It looks like they've been photoshopped into the picture. And why not just keep going? Here they are again. They've dragged some local kids into the picture too. Jim, do you remember much about Casablanca?
Not a whole lot. I don't remember that much, other than that it was a mess. I'll say that.
Yeah.
The harbor was all sunk. They sunk all the ships in the harbor to block entrance and all that. But but Casablanca, there wasn't nothing there. I mean, public restrooms was out in the middle of the street and what have you, you know. Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, it was a dirty place. It really was. Mhm.
Sure. Not quite the romantic image
No,
that
it's
we have
not.
of Casablanca.
No, it's not romantic at all.
So that was the first of Plunkett's 6 invasions during the war, and it was just going to get more difficult, let's say, from there. After Casablanca in November 42, the Plunkett comes back to the United States, and they acquire a new captain, Captain Eddie Burke. He was an Annapolis graduate, and this is him right here. You know, they hadn't seen much of the war in Casablanca, and, you know, the men in the Plunkett, and they were itching to get into it now. And it just didn't happen right away. They were engaged in these convoys. They came back from Casablanca to Brooklyn. They were down in the Norfolk Navy Yard in Brooklyn. They began to train up off the coast of Connecticut in Long Island Sound. They were screening merchant ships on the East Coast because the U-boats were taking a terrible toll. But every now and then, they would have these ships parties in New York back in the day at the Hotel St. George, which may have been the largest hotel in the world back then. And you can see Jim Phelps right here in the midst of this group at the party in March of 1943. These guys were young. They were caught up in the most cataclysmic event in the history of the world. In this same picture, this is only half of Plunkett's crew with a lot of their family or USO girl dates or their actual friends, girlfriends or wives. You look at this picture, Jim is way back here, and right here, just behind Captain Ed Burke and this woman with the tall hair is John Gallagher, you know, peeking out from behind this woman. So that's John. In this picture, it hangs on the wall of Jim's den out in St. Peter's, which is where I saw it for the first time, and it didn't take long to recognize John Gallagher poking out of that picture behind that the captain and the woman with the big hair. So we'll jump ahead now, because now after this party, the Plunkett goes to Europe, and this is where things really heat up for the Plunkett. In the spring, the Allies at this point have defeated the Germans in North Africa. And now they're making their first move on Europe. And this takes place in July of 1943 with the invasion of Sicily. And now from now in July of 1943 until the invasion of Normandy at Omaha Beach, Plunkett is in the midst of it, in the thick of it, for all of this time. And the ship would have its defining moment at Anzio in January of 1944. But before that happened, they were engaged in a number of invasions, and they were constantly, it seemed, under aerial assault. So these are young men who have been on the ship. Jim has been on the ship for about a year now, coming into Sicily at this first invasion. And as I say, this was the moment they'd been waiting for. I mean, these guys signed up and they wanted to do their part, and they wanted to get in the thick of it. In fact, a number of them, including Jim, I think, were writing in their journals after the invasion that this was the moment, this was the day they'd been waiting for. You know, the Maddox, which was another Navy destroyer on the invasion of Sicily, as soon as they charged into harm's way, they were hit by the German Luftwaffe, and that ship went down in less than a minute with 202 men and officers. It was that perilous. The next day, Plunkett arrived, had convoyed some landing craft and troop ships into Gela off Sicily, and the Luftwaffe attacked again. And this was the first time that Jim had come under aerial assault. The Luftwaffe hit the Robert Rowan, and this was what it looked like from the decks of the Plunkett. It was an ammunition ship, the Robert Rowan was. You know, when a bomb hit a ship, it didn't always look like this, but when it hit an ammunition ship, it could look like this. And whether the Allies could hold the beachhead or not was a little bit in question. Jim, you remember that, don't you? Don't you remember the first invasion at Sicily?
Yes, now Sicily you're talking about.
That's right. And you were on the midship
Yeah.
repair party. Can you talk a little bit about what your job was at General Quarters?
Well, midship repair party naturally is supposed to take care of whatever comes up. And we would huddle in between the two deck houses and watch what was going on, you know. And nothing went our way at all. But it was busy all the time.
Sure. And when Jim says nothing went his way at all, it's because none of the bombs that were falling in the vicinity hit the Plunkett. Had any of those ships, had the ship been damaged, it was going to be Jim's job, along with the other men in the midship repair party, to fight that fire and do damage control. Now, that was the first invasion that was really hot for Plunkett. The second invasion happened at Salerno. And at Salerno, the Germans hit a hospital ship. This is it here, the Newfoundland, which was way off the coast. And when the Plunkett found out that this ship was hit, it raced out to try and save the ship. And Jim, this ship didn't look much as it does in this picture when you saw it. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you saw when the Newfoundland, when you saw the Newfoundland that first time.
Well, she had been hit and she was burning. She was afire totally from end to end almost. And we was called along with another destroyer to fight the fire. And the only way we had was to drag our hoses across the forecastle. The captain nosed the ship up to it, and we clumb over the front of the ship onto the deck of the Newfoundland, and we drug our hoses with us and everything. And it was a pretty good fire. And I know the hoses are all made to weep so they can be drugged through fire and such as that, and they don't burn up. And they kept that. I know we'd squirt water down and keep our shoes wet. And the manholes were all open, and it was just a ball of fire. It was a big fire.
Right.
And you'd throw water in there, and it's just like if you was throwing gasoline on it, it'd flare up. Of course, that was a steam probably causing that. But we didn't make a dent in it, the fire, so they called us off about 3 hours later, I think it was.
And then later that night, the Plunkett had to scuttle that hospital ship. It couldn't.
Yeah, well, we got ordered to sink it. Yes.
That's right. When Plunkett came back into the roadstead at Salerno, the ship again was under aerial assault, but here at Salerno, the Plunkett took out the first two planes of the war. The ship got it with its 5-inch guns there. So, as Jim and I were talking a lot about this, and things like this were happening. I mean, the ship was, as I say, it was under assault from the air. They were always alert for the possibility of enemy submarines. There were E-boats to look out for, and you've seen what can happen when a bomb hits a ship, what it looks like when you are under aerial assault. And I asked Jim once if he'd ever been scared during the war. And Jim, you remember going to that Red Cross Club with Cliff Dornberg?
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. The one time you were scared.
Well, a Ouija board, we call them Ouija boards, where you put your fingers on this little block and it moves around by itself, So I was stupid enough to ask a question if I was going to live through the war. And it went around the board and what have you, and it ended up on no, N-O, no. And that kind of set me back a little bit. But so then I got thinking about it. Well, I said, I'll ask at the date and it gave me a date on it. I forget exactly what it was, August the 3rd or something. I don't know what it was for sure, but it didn't bother me until a few times where we was under a rescue mission, and we was going in the thick of it then, and then using our floodlight, and that got to me pretty good. Yeah. Mhm.
That's right.
But
And
everything turned out wrong.
one of the things that Jim had remembered at one point was that the date that the Ouija board said that he was not going to make it was a day
Oh,
the Plunkett
yeah.
went after the buck,
Yeah.
October 9th. The Plunkett got a call that one of the
Yeah.
destroyers had been hit, and they were out there with their searchlight at night. There were men dead in the water. The Plunkett was retrieving men just as fast as they could, and
Yeah.
and that was what you remember, Jim. It was that day that you were supposed to, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the night we did 37 knots. Yeah. Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, that was quite a sight because we was running from Palermo, Sicily, to the point of where she got hit, and we was running 37 knots, and that equals to 42 miles an hour. And we was throwing a wake 10, 15 feet behind the ship. And I went back there on the fantail. I says, I got to go back and see that the wake. And I got scared from sitting on that fantail, looking at that wake coming behind us. I said, if this ship would happen to stop now, all that water would be right on us. So I went back up forward.
Right. In the Plunkett, they retrieved a number of survivors in the buck, and Jim survived that night, as all the men did on the Plunkett. We're just giving sort of a cursory overview of what happened to the Plunkett. The book, of course, goes into much more detail, but we'll jump ahead here to Anzio, because this was really the defining moment.
This is anti-aircraft fire. This is what
Yeah,
it looks
it was
like.
the
How
plaque.
much bullets are going up in the air on our guns. Mhm.
And so I'll just give you just sort of a basic now on what's happened. I began talking today about Frank and John Gallagher getting together right before the invasion at Anzio. And Plunkett went in, and it was what Jim calls a milk run, because they didn't come under fire right away. But on January 24th, things were heating up with the Luftwaffe. And they made the Plunkett called the men to general quarters 6 different times throughout the day of January 24th, and then a 7th time right at dusk. And this is when things really got hot for the Plunkett. Now, all of the men are at general quarters, including my great uncle, who was a gunner on a 20 millimeter gun. There were 6 of them on the Plunkett. The Plunkett had 4 5-inch guns and a 1.1-inch gun. And for 25 minutes, the Plunkett dodged bomb after bomb. They dodged torpedoes. They did everything to skirt the enemy assault. For sure, the Plunkett took out 2 planes at Anzio. They probably got a 3rd plane, and they damaged a 4th plane in the midst of this action. Now, most of the aerial assaults in the Mediterranean during the Second World War were quick flyovers. 3 minutes, the planes would swoop in, but they kept the Plunkett, 12 to 14 bombers kept the Plunkett in its sights for 25 full minutes. And one of those planes eventually landed a 550-pound bomb on the 1.1-inch gun mount. And when that thing blew, it changed everything. Jim, maybe you could talk a little bit about where you were and what you were doing when that bomb hit.
Well, 2 weeks prior to getting hit, I was moved from repair party into the forward fire room, which is where I should have been, because I was carrying a rating for that water tender in that time. But anyway, I was on the phones, and we'd had a lot of changes of speed and all that, and we were pretty busy. And when we got hit, it was like a big thud, and all the lights went out. Of course, the emergency came on, but it was like if somebody had grabbed a ship and just pushed it straight down. But the feeling was when it started rising again, it just eased up real slow. And I told the head watch, I says, I'm going to go topside and see what happened, because we was all didn't know what was going on. So I broke the hatch and looked aft, and we was just total of fire aft from about midship back. And I thought to myself, that's where I'd been, you know, and I knew the repair party would have been wiped out. And the fantail repair party couldn't do nothing because they was beyond the fire. And I said to myself, shall I go back? And naturally I did. I run back there. I called down the hatch and I says, I'm going aft. We're afire. And I come down the starboard side. As you can see the picture there, it was pretty messed up. And so I got the handy billy. Me and another fella got a handy billy from that was strapped to the wall. Got it set up and put a suction hose over the side and got it running, and got got water on the nozzle, and we had fire on the hose, and then water in the fire. And by that time, more personnel had showed up, and I told the fellow that I was relieving the nozzle and that I had to go back to my station. So I went back up to the forward fire room then, and it wasn't a pretty sight. No.
Right.
That's about all I can say about that.
For me, this is one of the most moving moments in this story. It takes place when Jim jumps out of that, when he sees nobody fighting that fire, and he jumps out of that hatch and goes with another fella to grab that water pump and put water on that flame. And I'll just read just a short paragraph here, an excerpt from the book that describes that moment. Topside now, Jim Phelps saw the shapes of men he knew down all over, and parts of men everywhere. He was no mathematician, but he knew enough calculus to understand that the properties of the derivatives would be no good, that what he was seeing was but a fraction of what was there. A horrible tally was to come, but first things first. Do your job, he thought. That was paramount. Do what you've been trained to do. It was a simple mandate. Even though he knew his job was now down in the fire room, it had been here, topside, until 2 weeks ago, with 9 other men who were nowhere to be seen. Unless they got the flames that wanted the ship's magazines and the ash cans, the carnage he'd seen would be but prelude. The blaze of that thought went down deep inside him and cauterized any inclination to assess the situation more deeply. He shut his mind down to everything but what he had to do next, his job. Check that, his old job. The Plunkett lost 53 men that night. 24 of the men they were able to recover and bury. 29 of the men were lost and were classified as missing for 1 year, and then they were moved into the ranks of the dead. This is where the Plunkett first buried its dead, in Palermo, right just 2 days after the bomb hit. Somewhere in this crowd of men here, Jim Phelps was standing. You were there, Jim, weren't you? This is your picture.
Yes. The whole crew was there.
Yeah.
That
Right.
who survived it. Yes.
And in one of these boxes was my great uncle John Gallagher. He was buried in this temporary graveyard first, and then he was relocated to the Sicily American Cemetery, American Military Cemetery in in Nettuno, which is just beside Anzio. And the doctor told my great-grandmother, who had suffered a stroke during the war, that she took the loss of her son so badly that he said, "You will not survive if your son is disinterred in Italy and brought home here. I don't think you'll survive." That's what the doctor told his brothers and sisters. And so they decided to let John remain buried in Sicily. And Jim, that was the thing that was important to you. You'd never understood. Is that right?
That's when you told me that, why that just kind of relieved me of all my thoughts about John being over there. I accepted it, and now that you visited his grave and everything, that you told me how nice it was, I think it was a very, very thing to do.
Right.
Is to leave John there, yes. Because his, according to you, how it must be a beautiful place to be for the rest of your time.
That's right. And when I did go there for the first time, Jim passed along to me a message. He asked me if I'd say something to John at his graveside, and I said that, and that's in the book. And so I think we'll leave it there. I think we have come right to the end of our hour. I certainly appreciate your joining us, and I thank you again, Jim, for all that you've done and for stepping up here today once again to talk about
But
your.
may
time.
I say something, Jim? My hearing aids went out on me, and I'm struggling to hear what you all say. But I heard pretty good, and I want to thank you very much for everything you did for me. Yes.
Well, it was a real privilege to remember this story with you. And Joe, I guess we'll turn it back to you at this point.
Well, that is a wrap. Jim, on behalf of the St. Louis Public Library and people like me who haven't had to know a day of hunger or adversity, to good men like you, thank you for your service.
All right.
Well, you're welcome.
James, thank you very much for writing such an engaging book, reporting this story for us. Guys, we really appreciate you all attending. This is the end of the program, and we thank you all. And this concludes the presentation, Unsinkable by James Sullivan. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you, Joe. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
See you, Jim.
Bye-bye, Jim.
See you later, Jim.